Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that was delayed due to the Delta variant. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. Slowly adjusting to life that's vaguely what we might call normal, I guess, but in a delayed fashion, as I think we're about to discuss. Let's jump in with our headlines. So, from The Sun, will we ever be free?
I like to think that was like it should be pronounced as like an anguished yell. Will we ever be free? This is the news that Freedom Day, June the 21st, which has now come and gone, has been delayed by the government officially. To be honest, I think we all knew it was kind of on the cards for a while. And it's mostly down to it was called the Indian, but now called the Delta variant. And I believe there's sort of like a Delta variant plus that's going around, which I think you get COVID in HD or something. I'm not quite sure. The whole thing with this new variant is that it's spreading. It's meant to be more contagious than original COVID. So that's causing some worry. And there's particular sort of hotspots in the north of the country that, although they haven't gone into official lockdown, have had some rules kind of adjusted. So it appears the government hasn't started to do a tiered system or started to roll things back, but they've at least paused the full opening up of the country as it was meant to be on June 21st and kicked the can down the road to somewhere in July. I think July 19th is the date that I have in my head that's been mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's essentially a 4-week delay or a month delay. So
it's not only to sort of like help stop the spread of this new variant, also the government believes that extra month will give them more time to get more people vaccinated. The idea that the more people you've got vaccinated, then either the variant won't spread as much across the vaccinated population, or at least it will keep hospital admissions down in a way that means that you won't have to go back into lockdown as we have before. But I think what's been slightly odd about this is clearly like the pause has happened, but I don't think, me personally, I wasn't affected by it as much as when they said, oh, lockdown's coming back, because you've kind of got your freedom and they're not taking any freedoms away. It's just sort of a delay to what's going on. And as mentioned in the preamble and mentioned other things, like I know obviously like weddings can't go ahead and large social gatherings, but just being able to see like close friends and family again, particularly when the weather's very nice, and being able to see even more people in your garden when it's summertime, it's kind of made it a little bit, it's had less of an impact for me, at least just personally speaking, than some of the other updates the government has had.
Worth saying, obviously, if someone had a wedding planned,
oh yeah, that sucks.
Just after June, that's going to be awful for them. But I think I would echo your statement that in general, I hadn't fully turned on the taps in seeing people yet. And so I've just continued as I was, which is much better than it was being stuck inside as we were in winter.
Yes.
So.
And even though like individuals like me might not be so bothered about it, like you said, there are impacts for businesses that maybe were planning on finally having everybody back June 21st. I know that Andrew Lloyd Webber was on the front page of the Telegraph basically saying, you'll have to lock me up because I'm going to open the theatres up anyway. We've been planning a big June 21st opening up, and now you're telling us it can't happen. So there certainly has been some pushback and some frustration from businesses who are looking forward to this, and like sports venues as well. I know like me and my dad had tickets to go to the cricket, and those have now been like refunded or cancelled because they can't have everybody in the stadium like they were expecting to. However, despite this pause, we have seen certain events or certain test events happen up and down the country. So one which a lot of people I know personally, or at least in my circle, have gone to was Download Festival, which was a completely like test event. So they said, we'll open up all the doors, let people in. There's testing, of course, to make sure people aren't actively taking COVID into that environment. But that would be a music festival under normal circumstances. You have big events like the British Grand Prix, which was meant to go ahead before July 19th. That's now going to be full capacity. So that's 140,000 people all in one venue. And that's going to be used as a test event as well. And I believe there's other sporting events like England is hosting a lot of the Euro 2020 games at Wembley, including the semi-finals and final. And I think those last two games are planned to be pretty much test events where they allow more than there was like a ratio for how many were allowed in your sports stadium. Basically, the government are going to up that. I don't think it will be full capacity, but it might be like 50% full rather than 20% full as it has been for the earlier games. So the government is clearly working on a strategy to open up more and is really focusing on these test events to see if they are vectors of the disease where like, oh my goodness, we've done some test events and it's really spread, we'll have to stop this, or oh no, they seem to be going well, let's continue opening up. So yeah, just keep a few eyes on that. There has been one graph that's been doing the rounds on Twitter, essentially, which shows that episodes of COVID have been going up in the UK more than they have in other like Western countries, despite our vaccinations. But I would be interested in, like, that is one factor of showing how COVID spreads. The next factor would be like, what's the level of hospitalizations we've got essentially from the disease? If the vaccination is keeping people out of hospital, then maybe that would be enough for the government to continue their opening up, despite the fact that COVID cases are rising. But that remains to be seen.
You would hope with enough vaccination, there's a point at which COVID just becomes a thing we live with. And I think that's the kind of turn of phrase that's been being used. So there would come a point where people could be infected. Because if you have the vaccine, you can still carry the virus. Like you just have very few negative, you get through it, basically, is the point. So yeah, it becomes a point where it's a bit like having flu, and it's a very different situation. We're not there yet, obviously, but yeah, as with all these things, people kind of glom onto certain numbers and things, and it's very interesting to see, as someone who works in science, like how things can kind of be taken out of context sometimes. And it's also obviously great that there's a lot of people who care about the stats and the numbers, because otherwise it wouldn't get talked about at all. But yeah, in the same way as when you see kind of political stuff being shared with like, oh, look at this number or whatever, always, take a step back and check that the thing you're seeing actually says what you think it's seeing.
Yeah, totally. I'm glad I've got a stats man like you on the podcast to keep me in check.
I'm not a stats person. I've done some stats, but yeah. Yeah, no, it's like people ask me stats questions, something like, you need a statistician. That's why it's a job. Moving on to our next headline. Hopeless bloke said hopeless bloke is hopeless, says hopeless bloke, the star.
Yeah.
That's quite a mouthful there.
It is. And this is, it's accompanied by a very strange picture. I know you haven't got it in front of you, but the star, they always dress up the government figures as clowns. They call Boris Johnson a clown. They're calling Dominic Cummings a clown. And they also refer to Matt Hancock as a clown, which kind of completes the circle that they're trying to describe on their front page. This is essentially more revelations from Dominic Cummings, who is maybe unhappy that he's not on the front pages for a couple of weeks. So feels like he has to drop a few dom shells, as they've now been called, to try and shake up British politics or the government. We talked in length last time about his appearance at the Select Committee and what he said, particularly about the handling of the pandemic. And he was particularly critical of Health Secretary Matt Hancock. What has happened since then is he has released like WhatsApp messages from the Prime Minister that basically catch the Prime Minister telling Dominic Cummings that Matt Hancock is totally bleeping hopeless, which kind of suggests that if the Prime Minister thinks his own Health Secretary is hopeless in private, why doesn't he act on that, or why doesn't he look to replace him with somebody more competent in that role, particularly during one of the biggest health crises the country's seen in a generation? I think these domshells, although they haven't had much impact on the kind of like public perception of Boris Johnson, I feel like your mind is made up one way or another. We kind of talked in the same way about Trump about this, but it does seem that Boris Johnson, you're either a fan or you're not. It does continue to paint a pattern of chaos and dysfunction within the government, and maybe a slightly worrying fact. I go on about this, but I talk about this cabinet and that I don't feel that it is particularly a skilled cabinet. I think it's a very loyal cabinet, but maybe not the best people in the best positions there. The fact that Johnson couldn't think of maybe a useful enough replacement for Hancock in that place. I think those texts go on, and he said, maybe I could put Gove in there, but I'm not sure. Like, if your only replacement is Michael Gove, then hey, we've got an issue with the quality of cabinet members that you have and the pool that you're able to draw from. So yeah, just a little story that rattled through the headlines a bit, and that the papers did focus on. I will be interested to hear what Mr. Cummings has to say next, because I'm sure he's sitting on a few more things to make things uncomfortable for Boris Johnson when he sees fit.
I mean, if he's at the point where he's releasing private communications with the Prime Minister, I think he must have a lot more stuff. Maybe not necessarily explosive, but I mean, he'll have a lot of stuff if that's the kind of thing he's willing to give out. So yeah, I suppose watch this space. But it, as you say, it hasn't really seemed to affect the PM at all. So moving on, our next headline: "Oh baby, what a lovin'." from the Daily Mail.
Yes, this was a headline accompanied by a picture of Boris Johnson and Carrie Simons' new baby at the G7 summit with her and Jill Biden on the beach in St. Ives in Cornwall. This was basically one of Boris Johnson's big tests as leader, hosting the first G7 summit, like I said, in Cornwall to try and promote a view of Britain officially outside of the EU, forging ahead on its own path. Basically, it was a big kind of the spotlight's on Britain. Don't mess this up, Boris, please. And I feel like it was a semi-competent showing from the Prime Minister and the rest of the G7. Most of the headlines, in fact, focused on the fact that the baby was there rather than any real policy decisions, which might go some way to show that nothing major was decided at this summit. The only thing that was sort of rattling on in the background was how particularly France would react and talk to Johnson about the EU and their breakup, particularly as there was a row going on in Northern Ireland about exporting sausages from Northern Ireland to the UK and the particular ins and outs of the Brexit trade deal that was signed. There was some sort of saber rattling, particularly from the papers who were trying to stir something up, but Boris Johnson did kind of slap that idea down that they were going to have a real falling out about that at the summit. So that kind of came to nothing. There's also the issue that it was the first summit where Joe Biden was the leader of the US rather than Donald Trump, and how Boris Johnson would interact with that. Of course, Boris liked to be quite close to Trump during those summits and was seen as one of the more key allies. The relationship with Biden, some worried, would be more frosty, particularly when Biden seems to have taken a particular interest in Northern Ireland and the peace process over there, and is reported basically saying that if you mess up the peace process in Northern Ireland because of what's going on with Brexit, then that might affect trade or future deals with the UK. Again, nothing big was sort of said on that, and I think the government, at least the Prime Minister, can say that he's come out of that without any major damage done. But I don't know if there was sort of the blossoming of a great new friendship as there was between Boris and Trump. So kind of a 0-0 draw for the Prime Minister here. Nothing spectacular, but no big own goals either.
Yeah, no, I didn't hear much about it either, I suppose. Those of us who listen to the BBC Newscast got quite a lot of Laura Koenigsberg enjoying ice cream and things like that, which tells you probably how little was really going on. They kind of, as you say, focused on the spat with France a bit. And then I think the other thing there was an announcement of these kind of climate goals, but it was also kind of, it was like an announcement of something that had already been announced, right?
Yes, I believe there was sort of like an announcement of them taxing big multinational corporations. I think that was...
Oh, there was also that, and then it didn't really have much teeth. So yeah, the fact that the big multinational corporations didn't call foul implies it's not really doing much.
Yeah, precisely. So yeah, not much actual concrete to come out of there. It was more I thought I should mention it, had a look at the headlines and thought, oh, this is important. And the more I looked into it, it was like, yeah, nothing really happened. But at least a little bit. I think from a PR point of view, big chance for Boris to put his foot in it, and he was able to walk away without making any major gaffes, which I know it's a low bar, but I think it's an achievement for our Prime Minister at least.
So moving on into our main story tonight, I believe the phrase is Liberal Democrats winning here. What am I talking about, Rob?
You're talking about the news that has rocked politics to its very core. The Chesham and Amersham by-election. Other words, the Lib Dems winning something. We talked about by-elections last time, didn't we, with Hartlepool and everything there.
And we were talking about how you can't necessarily draw conclusions from a by-election. And so immediately the entirety of the politosphere? I don't know what we call the blogosphere for politics. I'm going to go with that, the politosphere. Suddenly making big claims off this one Lib Dem win, which I'm sure we're going to go into detail on.
Yeah, so kind of the headline figures are there was a by-election in a part of Buckinghamshire called Chesham and Amersham, which the Conservatives kind of really expected to win. Get my facts and figures and accidentally clicked the 29 election in its entirety rather than the...
No.
So in 2019, the Conservatives had won this seat with 30,000 votes, and the Lib Dems had become second place with 14,000 votes. 2019, of course, an electoral high point for the Conservatives. However, national polling suggests that they are polling well above Labour. And as you know, I have dismissively said since the 2019 election, Lib Dems kind of, they're not going to be up to much, are they? I would be surprised if they got anywhere. However, to the more politically astute person watching, there were some reports coming out of here that they believed the election would be closer than the Conservatives thought. And there are a number of reasons that we'll go into about why that is. But essentially, people thought the Lib Dems might push the Conservatives close here, but you don't really overturn a deficit of 15,000 overnight. There needs to be a more sort of significant political shift. And given the fact the Conservatives have just done fairly well in the local elections, the council elections, and have won the Hartlepool by-election when they were a government in power, what was to say that they weren't going to win this one? However, surprise, surprise, when the results came through in the morning, it appeared that the Lib Dems had beaten the Conservatives with 21,517 votes to the Conservatives' 13,489. So between December 2019 and June 2021, the Conservatives have been able to leak 17,000 votes, basically, which set alarm bells ringing in the Conservative Party and has led to a bit of a cross-examination of what exactly went wrong and what this could mean in the future for similar constituencies in the next big election.
For reference, that's a 30% swing to the Liberal Democrats, which is
huge.
A large percentage. It's kind of similar to the things we were discussing in Hartlepool, actually. And, well, so as I alluded to just before there was much rejoicing from the Lib Dems and people all over the place saying, what could this mean? There was a very funny moment where Ed Davey, the head of the Liberal Democrats, had a literal blue wall and a mallet and whacked it to show how well they were doing. I'm not sure. I think maybe I should give my kind of broad thoughts here before we delve into the nitty gritty, but I'm not sure this one data point is going to give, I don't think this single data point is reason for the Lib Dems to assume they're on some upward trajectory. We can go into the details of what was going on in this particular election in more detail, but I think it was very weird, kind of I know that leaders have to stand up and say, look how well we did. We discussed this a bit last time where we were talking about how the Conservatives were like, well, of course we've done really, really well, etc., and Labour are destroyed now, and we're like, well, probably not really. It's kind of that similar idea where, a leader gets up and is like, look, we've won here, so we're always going to win. And it's like, that's not how this works. But politicians have to politician, I guess. So I suppose the next thing to ask is, what were the big issues here? And why is this not necessarily indicative of the country as a whole, especially in the wake of local elections where the Conservatives did fairly well?
So some of the reasons that have been brought out are more local and regional rather than national problems for the Conservatives. And I think that's one reason, particular why the Lib Dems did so well. Although I've sometimes criticised the Lib Dems' national kind of vision, where they've been able to historically pick up seats is where they focus intently on local issues and what is happening in that constituency, and then build from there. That's what the Lib Dems have actually been excellent about in the past few years. I will say that because they are a third party and they don't have many seats, they really value the seats that they do have and fight tooth and nail to keep them, particularly once they've won them. So I think that the constituents of Chesham and Amersham will be quite pleased with the MP that they've been able to get in and will try and make an influence on their lives. The two main issues I had were, so HS2 is the first. This is, of course, the high-speed rail line that's meant to run from London to Manchester. Am I getting that right?
Yes, it's London to North. So there is high-speed 2 comes in 2 phases, just to confuse you. So we haven't finished phase 1 yet, which is London to Birmingham. And then there's phase 2, which is actually 2 lines that do Birmingham to Leeds and Birmingham on to Crewe and Manchester. So yes, it's London to the north in general. But the thing that's actually being built at the moment is London to Birmingham. And people in the countryside through which that train line is running are not happy, and they haven't been happy about it for quite some time. It's not surprising that people would vote against Conservatives who are pretty pro HS2.
Yeah, precisely. And the fact that this line effectively was very much going through this constituency made it a big talking point. I've actually heard from the articles I've read that it was a big talking point from the Greens first and foremost, and is kind of a policy point that was adopted by the Lib Dems to try and get them through when it came up. And like, oh, our Green candidate opposes HS2. Do you oppose it as well? Yes, of course I do, said the Lib Dem candidate, and that seemed to really help them. I did hear tell of like some oddly like nasty exchanges between Lib Dems and Greens in this by-election, which is something that I can't really imagine in my head. They're not necessarily seen as like nasty conniving parties, but to think of these two great political powerhouses going head to head is just quite funny to me. But anyway, you've got HS2, which was one of the big issues locally. Also, there's about planning reform, which was something that I wouldn't necessarily say was on voters' minds initially, but it appeared to be messaging that the Lib Dems had that got through to those constituents and became a big talking point in that election. So one of the big planning reforms that the Conservatives have now put through is that it's far easier for local councils to buy land and make space for social housing, which is a policy that works particularly well if you are targeting red wall seats, former Labour areas, because it means that you can have more council housing. And that kind of really is a boon to the working class and will undermine the Labour vote in those areas. However, in these more conservative-leaning shires, it appears that the last thing they want is more social housing in their constituency, and they actually want there to be slightly more restrictive planning rules, particularly where those houses are built. They would rather that effort was focused on brownfield sites rather than green sites. So with those sort of two issues intact, you get a liberal Democrat Party that is focused very much on a kind of a NIMBYism platform. NIMBYism, of course, standing for
Not in my backyard.
Exactly, yeah. So those small local pressure groups that bizarrely policies of easier planning for houses and supporting HS2 are Lib Dem national policies. However, this was a Lib Dem candidate that said they would go against their party on this. And it appears those two issues were the ones that got through most with voters in that area. So I think those are the two kind of big local issue points that really worked in the Lib Dems' favour and appeared to undermine the Conservative support, or at least suppress the vote. We said that the Lib Dems actually only they increased their vote by about 7,000, but the Conservative turnout in this by-election was far lower than it was in 2019, which seems to suggest that the former Conservative voters, if they didn't vote Lib Dem, they stayed at home rather than voting for that Conservative candidate.
As I say, that's fairly similar to what we pointed out with the Hartlepool by-election, where it seems like actually a lot of potential Labour voters just didn't turn out for that election.
Yeah, precisely. And
so the actual shift as a percentage sounds high, but actually that's percentage shift if you have a percent from last time and a percent from this time, but actually it's not as big. Though still a stonking win, as people would say. I suppose another thing that often gets touted when we're in election season is, will there be tactical voting? So do you think there was a concerted effort to get Lib Dem candidate through here to beat the Conservatives, or is it just chance? I mean, you've already mentioned a bit of a animosity between the Greens and the Lib Dems.
So I think that there certainly was tactical voting in this election, and it's an often touted thing, particularly people on the left. They have a look at the results and they go, oh, if only you added Labour, Liberal and Green votes together, we could have overturned the Conservative vote. Now, as it was in 2019, that wouldn't have been true. The Conservatives would still have been safe with their 30,000 votes if you add up all the results of Liberal Democrat, Labour and Green. But when you look at the results from the 2021 by-election, maybe one of the most striking results there is the result of the Labour candidate, who, Labour are are one of the two main parties. They are always going to put a MP up for election in whatever by-election happens. But their share of the vote plummeted. They got 7,166 in 2019. They only got 622 votes in the 2021 by-election, and lost their deposit, which is usually the ultimate sign of humiliation at an election if you fail to go over that threshold and you have to pay your deposit back to the government for standing in that election. With those numbers, it makes me feel that maybe a lot of Labour voters, A, either stayed away, or B, said, yes, I will lend my vote to the Lib Dems this time round in order to defeat the Conservatives, because I feel we've got a real chance of doing that here. Of course, it's a lot easier for it's the unique conditions of a by-election that I feel make tactical voting more plausible and does play into Lib Dems' hands, because when you're talking about a national election, a lot of people would say, hey, look, I want to vote Lib Dem. However, I think it's really unlikely that they will get enough votes throughout the country in order to have Ed Davey as my leader, for example. Therefore, I'm going to give it to Labour, who are the obvious second party choice if I want to defeat the Conservatives. I'm sorry, that's how it is. That's me being practical. But in a by-election, you're not voting for a national leader. You're voting very much for your local MP, and you don't kind of like have the risk of...
You're not going to accidentally overturn the government because you know what the majority is.
A Labour candidate on your doorstep would say, look, a vote for Lib Dems is a vote for Boris Johnson in power. You know, only we can defeat the Conservatives. That message is going to cut through far less when it's a by-election, and that's just simply never going to happen as a result. So I think that helped the Lib Dems massively encourage this tactical voting and showed that, yeah, if everybody does band together in these type of seats, there is a chance of overturning massive Conservative majorities. So yeah, again, I think that's like a big factor that helped the Lib Dems and is maybe proof that if you want to defeat the Conservatives in these type of constituencies, there might need to be more of a concerted effort amongst those on the left to, you know, see which left-leaning party is in second place. I'll vote for them instead. But that being said, I think the Greens obviously fought hard for this one as well. They did lose votes compared to their 2019 share. But as I've said, anecdotally, I've heard that they were very much fighting for this constituency, and it appears that even the Lib Dems kind of stole the HS2 idea from the Greens and botched it onto their MP's policy for this election, just to try and make sure that they didn't alienate those people who may have voted Green if the Lib Dems had stuck to their guns and said, no, we actually support HS2. I think you would have seen a Conservative victory in this election, but that just wasn't the case.
Tactical voting, clearly important. But I suppose another thing, and the thing this inevitably leads to us discussing, is how are the Lib Dems doing nationally? I mean, just how are the Lib Dems? No, I mean, so we've discussed the Lib Dems a bit in the past. Obviously, they famously were very anti-Brexit, and that was kind of their standout thing that didn't particularly help them in previous general elections. Where are they now? Like, how much does that overshadow them? And do you think essentially, Pete, there's still this divide over who voted for Brexit and who didn't, or have we kind of moved past that?
So I was quite critical of the Lib Dems running on that 2019 Brexit, like, we are the only party that truly opposes Brexit platform. At the start, I thought it was a good idea because it was their kind of USP that stuck in the voters' minds, whereas the Conservatives were very much for Brexit and Labour were flip-flopping between the two, or at least in the public opinion. The Lib Dems said, no, we are the only party that will definitely overturn the referendum result if you vote for us. And for maybe like one moment when Parliament was in chaos and there was an election going to be called, Jo Swinson thought she actually had like a big possibility, if all the Remainers got behind her, that she might be able to, you know, get second place in the election and shake things up. As it was, the message of get Brexit done appeared to be much more of a attractive message for the voters, and that's why we have the big Conservative majority that we have nowadays. And that's when I thought that, hey, Lib Dems are going to be in the political wilderness for a while because they've really nailed their mast to this Brexit idea, and now they are clearly on the losing side. Now that deal is done and dusted. However, I think maybe long term it's kind of paid off for the Lib Dems, at least in these sort of constituencies. So whereas we've seen the rebalancing of the like social norms and political divides in the north for Hartlepool, where we're seeing those Labour voters who maybe drifted towards UKIP or the Brexit Party now finding their home with the Conservatives as a natural place for them to vote. In these Shire constituencies, they've now seen Brexit happen, and a harder Brexit than maybe many of them expected delivered. And now we've had the trade deal through, and it appears that there are certain cracks or flaws in those. People who voted Remain, but maybe would have stayed with the Conservatives if they'd had quite a soft Brexit, I think now are edging towards the Lib Dems or seeing them as a party that they remember in their head of going, oh, they were very much against Brexit and I voted Remain in the past. I think I can lend my vote to them. Now, the flip side of this is you might have Conservative voters who voted Leave, who may have flip-flopped between the Conservative and Lib Dems in the past, now feeling completely alienated from the Lib Dems because they were the only ones that wanted to stop the democratic will of the people and overturn the Brexit referendum result. So I think they may have alienated a lot of people there, but in these type of shire constituencies, the ones that were quite heavily Remain anyway, it seems to have given the Lib Dems kind of like a legacy of voter, or at least kept them in the voters' minds saying, yes, I'm willing to tie my vote to that party because I think that they were ultimately right about Brexit, even if that conversation or what we can do about it is over. I feel that they've got, I've got some skin in the game here. I will give them my support, where in the past I may have gone for a softer Conservative candidate.
I would probably add on to that I feel that tracks with what I've seen, and obviously pinch of salt whenever it's an anecdote. I've spoken to people who voted. Obviously I've spoken to people who voted for Brexit and then said they didn't actually think it was a good idea in retrospect. But, there were all those stories around. It's very easy to find one or two people who have changed their mind, right? But I think what you're saying, where they're, people who have always voted Conservative, but might be a bit closer to the Lib Dems, and then they see that the Lib Dems are all anti-Brexit, and then are now kind of reassessing things in the cold light of day, might be like, well, actually, let's give them a chance. Could be quite a powerful force for the next few years at least. It's a kind of interesting discussion, I suppose, about how long like the political memory is, because we're seeing a lot of people saying, oh, well, I've always voted this way because my parents. Same in the Hartlepool by-election, where people were saying, oh, well, we've always voted this way, so we chose to change where we were voting, because there are some people who vote for a particular party because that's what they grew up voting for. So it's kind of, there's an interesting thing there, and I wonder how many people are in that kind of camp. How many people, non-swing voters, essentially, people who've always been one party through and through, who may now be reconsidering who they vote for. So if the Lib Dems have got a boost there, obviously the Conservatives did poorly. So does this maybe show a greater weakness for the Conservatives? I know we've said we shouldn't extrapolate from one event, but does this suggest actually that they could have problems nationally?
So, in short, the answer is yes. Not big problems in the way that they might lose a next election on this, but it might make things difficult for them. And even as the Conservatives are creeping into that red wall in the north and winning seats up there that we thought they'd never win, the opposite may be true in the south, where these voters feel that they have been. The more that the Conservatives put focus on sorting out the north and those problems, those voters in the south that always voted Conservative might say, hey, you're neglecting us and why we voted Conservative. We may go for another option in the Lib Dems. And there have been highlights, particularly because of the massive swing to the Lib Dems. There's been a study basically on this blue wall of seats and what might happen if we see similar amounts of swing in the future. So if you have a look at the blue wall constituencies in 2019 and then apply a quarter of the swing that we see in the Chesham and Amersham by-election, then the Conservatives would lose 8 seats and the Lib Dems would gain 8 seats. Not a massive loss for the Conservatives, but certainly embarrassing for them, and that's quite a significant rise for the Lib Dems, who have a fairly small pool of MPs. Then when you have a look, if there's half the amount of swing that we saw in the Chesham by-election, the numbers change quite dramatically. The Conservatives lose 17 seats and the Lib Dems gain 17 seats. That's no wins for Labour, no changing hands of votes for Labour in this blue wall. They all go to the Lib Dems. So you can see now that if that result is repeated, and maybe they don't need the extraordinary circumstances of a by-election, the Lib Dems, they just need a general election. Sorry, I wanted to call it just a basic election, but a general election is what would happen. Then you start to lose some pretty big scalps in that region, and a swing of 17 seats is far more significant than it was anyway. And you might lose some big names and some big scalps in that area as well. I think the most prominent is Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab, who would lose his seat as a result of that. So we're not talking again, we're talking 17 seats for half the swing. So we're not talking like an earth-shattering, this will undermine all of the Conservatives' policies forever. But as you've got that image of Ed Davey in your mind of hitting the blue wall with his little mallet, he has got his eye on 10 to 15 more bricks in that wall where he thinks the Lib Dems can make a real dent in the Conservatives' amount of seats that they've got in Parliament and in their majority. A smaller majority would make things way more difficult for Boris Johnson to get some of his more extreme views through Parliament. And particularly if the Conservatives ignore this flank, I think they've kind of, as once we said, that Labour took those red wall seats for granted, you've got the same coming true for the Conservatives, maybe thinking that those blue wall seats in the South would always vote Conservative no matter what they do. It's clear that lots of the things the Conservatives are doing at the moment are turning off enough voters that make them switch from the Conservatives to the Lib Dems. I'm talking about your voter that voted Remain in 2015, was quite a soft Conservative, so probably would have voted for Theresa May when they thought they might get like a softer Brexit through. They might feel that they don't like the way Boris Johnson does business. Again, I'm going to compare him to Trump, but like Trump was an atypical politician. He didn't do things the way you were meant to and was quite brash. Boris is also kind of quite operating politics in a very different way to a Cameron or a May. And I think some of those soft Conservatives basically can say, I don't like Boris Johnson very much and the way that he does government. That is enough for me to switch my vote to the Lib Dems as effectively a protest. Or, hey, I actually believe in their politics a bit more, so that's why I'm going to change.
It's kind of similar point, I suppose, but with how Boris went single-mindedly after Brexit, like I have definitely spoken to people who vote Conservative and they're like, well, you know, that they see like that they weren't Brexiteers and they see that as, you know, while they may not have accepted arguments before that, you know, the Conservatives are like anti-immigration and stuff, even though I would argue they clearly were, in light of that kind of single-mindedness towards getting Brexit done and all of that. If you aren't someone who supported Brexit, that's another reason to shift. And we've already mentioned the fact that Liberal Democrats were the one party who kind of stood on, we're not going to back Brexit.
Precisely. And it's the Conservatives are then left with a conundrum, aren't they? Because they can't get just rid of Boris Johnson to try and win these seats back, because it appears that Boris Johnson is reaching parts of the country that old Conservative leaders couldn't up in the north. So they might make the political calculation that actually the seats we can gain in the north, it's worth losing a couple of seats down here. Maybe we're not going to worry about it so much. But you're certainly not going to lose Boris as a leader. Secondly, like we've talked about Brexit and the effects of Brexit, the more Brexit goes on, and if it turns out to be a bad idea, Boris Johnson's particularly wed to that. The rest of the Conservative Party is. That's less of like you can't backtrack from that decision quickly. It's not just sack a minister and we're good again. It's, actually I'd have to sack the whole cabinet and Boris Johnson and seriously rethink what we've done for the past 5 years if we want to get these voters back. So it's this longer term shift that might be more worrying for the Conservative Party, particularly when they've just redrawn the boundaries that will change 2022, I believe. And with those redrawn boundaries, the Conservatives may have redrawn them thinking that, hey, these are really safe Conservative seats. We don't need to worry about any challenges here, when in fact they may have just put a load more Lib Dems in a constituency that was previously safe and will be undermining their vote share in the South. So I think it's really interesting, this one. This is a result that came out of nowhere when we're talking about political upsets, because, hey, the Conservatives are polling really well across the country, aren't they? You look at the YouGov surveys and they're 44% compared to Labour's 31%, and the Lib Dems are somewhere between the 10% and the Greens are on 7%. So nationally, Boris Johnson will feel that his policies are working really well. Why should he change his policies to try and mitigate problems in one or two constituencies? But those one or two constituencies could easily become 20, which could snowball into 40. And if you've got a swing of 40 seats away, then all of a sudden you've lost your majority for the next parliament. So the Conservatives and Boris Johnson do need to be really careful with how much they push their new agenda, because it could end up alienating the seats that always used to vote for them in the past, and then that would be a big problem for them.
I think I agree, as I usually do, with your analysis there. So I think the other thing we want to talk about is there is another upcoming by-election, but instead that's a Labour-held seat. So are we going to be able to draw any conclusions from this and Hartlepool together to maybe try and predict what's going to happen in Batley and Spen, which I appreciate you may not have heard of Batley and Spen. It's in Yorkshire, but it is famously where Joe Cox was MP.
Yes. So this is another big by-election on the horizon. And once again, people are predicting embarrassment for Labour. So as much as we've talked up the Lib Dems and they're, seem to be doing quite well against the Conservatives and their current strategy, Labour appear to be in the wilderness when it comes to how they can fight the Conservatives, particularly in their traditional red wall seats, of which this is one. And ironically, this by-election is kind of entirely of Labour's own making, kind of shooting themselves in the foot. So this by-election came about because the MP, Tracy Brabin, who used to be an actress in Coronation Street, was elected as Mayor of West Yorkshire. And you can't be Mayor of West Yorkshire and a standing MP. So she resigned as an MP, opening up the by-election seat. The reason that Tracy ran for Mayor of West Yorkshire was that she was moved on from a post of Shadow Culture Secretary, which many felt that she was kind of like, hey, she's been in Coronation Street, that's going to be her real desire. She's a fairly well-known up in those parts. That would be the one thing that she really desired and wanted to do. And for some reason, Keir Starmer sidelined her for no apparent reason, as what people can see. Next of all, what Keir Starmer didn't do is, once he fired her from that role, he didn't then forbid her, as Labour of the Leader Party, to run as Mayor of West Yorkshire or be nominated for that, because if she didn't do that, then Labour wouldn't be facing this problem until the next general election of what they do in Batley and Spen. However, they've opened up basically another opportunity for the Conservatives to go in, maybe win a red wall seat, and current opinion polls are suggesting that there's a Survation poll done between the 9th and 17th of June that suggests that the Conservatives will win that constituency by 47%, with Labour on 41%, the Lib Dems on 3%. You also have a bit of a wild card in the selection of everybody's favourite Big Brother cat housemate, George Galloway, appearing, who has traditionally had quite a big pull amongst Muslim voters. That's where he's had the most success in the past, putting on particular issues that affect them. And it appears once again that he is able to cut through to those voters that would traditionally vote Labour. So any votes George Galloway is getting will undermine Labour's position in that constituency as well. And considering that the Survation poll puts George Galloway's party on 6%, that 6% is the difference between Labour winning and losing that election as it stands.
I was just going to ask, actually, you mentioned George Galloway, and until you said 6% there, I was like, well, that's not a problem. Has he done, I appreciate that's what the poll says, but my understanding is that George Galloway has done very poorly in all of his previous, so for example, in the 2019 general election, he got a mere 489 votes. So I can't help but wonder if that might be a polling error there for George Galloway, and on the day less people vote for him, unless of course they're doing it as a protest.
So
vote.
he is traditionally very hard to predict and survey. Like, you won't know because of the nature of his party and what voters you can reach. Listening to Stephen Bush from the New Statesman, who's far more knowledgeable on these things than I am, he said that in the past George Galloway has had a tremendous pull against traditionally like Muslim and uneducated voters, like that demographic he performs very well at, and that's also a demographic that's traditionally very hard to poll and get hold of and get an accurate representation of how much they're going to support them, which means that this Survation poll must be taken with a pinch of salt about how much, but Stephen's estimation was that survey probably underestimated how much George Galloway did rather than overestimated, because the nature of polling is that you tend to get more politically active people responding to your polls. Those who tend to be more knowledgeable about politics. It's one of the reasons why I think in the Hartlepool by-election, surveys kind of suggested that the Northern Independence Party would get far more than it actually did. It's because the Northern Independence Party was only really supported by those with a particular sort of like very niche interest in politics. They were also more likely to respond to those YouGov calls to do surveys on the issue as well. So there's a lot of potential for embarrassment for the Labour Party again here, and for every problem that we say the Conservatives have had in that by-election that the Lib Dems won, it's almost seen as a bonus for them here. And the results of that Conservative humiliation there will very quickly be washed away if they are once again able to take a constituency off Labour, being the incumbent party winning a by-election, winning two would show big problems for Keir Starmer, or maybe more accurately, the Labour Party in the direction that they're going there, that they seem to still be leaking seats and not seem to stop that momentum from the Conservative Party when these by-elections keep coming up. So it's one we'll probably look at next time, definitely. And it's just worth pointing out that...
Oh, yes, I can't wait to see the results so that we can talk about it.
As the Conservatives lose one seat, it's very likely that actually after 3 by-elections, the Conservatives might be up 1 MP rather than down 3, which in a normal by-election cycle with a party that's been in power for 10 years, you would expect that party to lose every seat that it contested. To win 2 would, again, show that the Conservatives are at least in the ascendancy in the north.
So, I mean, another exciting by-election. We'll report on that next time. Before we finish for this evening, I've just thrown a link in the show notes. I do want to quickly bring back the polls. Yeah, we were discussing elections, which are obviously the best kind of poll, as we always say. But that aside, we did mention a while back the upcoming German federal election in 2021, which is later in the year. And I thought I'd just dip back into those polls again. I've posted a link there, and it's all on actually a very nice chart on Wikipedia, which is rare, I find. For generally, the polls don't seem to get as good a chart on Wikipedia. But we last mentioned them when the Greens seem to be in ascendancy. It's interesting to see that the Greens are dropping again. And so it was back in like start of May, end of April, that the Greens overtook CDU and CSU, which are the two kind of Christian parties and currently the current leading group. So it's 2 separate parties that are in a like joint coalition essentially, who've been leading the government and are Merkel's party. But it seems like FDP is on the rise, and that explains why Green is dropping down, where FDP is the Free Democratic Party, which is not, as it might sound, one that's a fairly recent kind of, knee-jerk type party. Has actually been around since 1948. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that. I know you've probably not been following it as closely as the UK.
I have not got particularly loads of thoughts about the German election. It will be something I'll need to study more. I know that it's Merkel is standing down, isn't she, from the, what's her party, the Christian Democrat?
She's
CDU,
the CDU, which is the Christian Democratic Union.
And what are they polling at?
So Union, which is the black one, is CDU and CSU, which, as I say, is like they basically go as one party, but it's like, I think it's because the CSU is just in Bavaria, but basically it's the 2 Christian parties in Germany that poll as one thing, because that's the current lead party that Merkel is part of. And then the Green Party was kind of rising up a lot, and we were talking about that last time. It's kind of an interesting thing to see, because we don't really have a very strong Green Party over here, although green ideas keep getting put into the main parties. And then it is good to see at least the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, which are their equivalent of a Brexit UKIP type party, are not doing particularly well. I mean, polling higher than you'd like them to, but still not doing massively
not enough
well.
to become part of I guess the real interest with me in German politics is the coalition building that happens once you've had that vote, because it's very rare, I think, if ever, that a party gets enough votes to form a government by itself. So it needs the support of those smaller parties. You wouldn't want the balance of power to be held by the AFU, as you mentioned. But it'd be really interesting to see if, obviously Merkel's stepping down, and she's been in charge of that country for over 20 years, nearly 21 years, I think it is in total. So to lose that power and have maybe a different party in charge or a different coalition would be eye-opening. It would be a massive kind of like change in the balance power of not only Germany, but in Europe, because Germany has been a figurehead of the EU for so long. If suddenly their main representative is not Angela Merkel and isn't from the same party, then that could have wide-reaching consequences. So yeah, definitely one that I'll have to keep an eye on a bit more and teach myself about.
Yeah, and it's definitely it's just Germany with the same leader in the same party for such a long time. There's such a known quantity. Like we know how Germany will react to things, and in a time that's been fairly turbulent in both European politics and world politics, Merkel has been there regardless. I mean, I know we will have some German listeners who may not like Merkel as a person or whatever. But as from an international view, the fact that it's the same person and you kind of reliably kind of expect Germany to do certain things it is a helpful thing. So it'll be interesting to see how that changes. Whatever happens, she's stepping down. So I don't know much about person who's standing to replace her. Off the top of my head, I've seen some discussion about it, but I haven't seen much. But yeah, interesting to see. So if you look at the coalitions that Germany's had, they've been CDU and CSU as one group, with the SPD, which is like essentially their Labour Party, I believe. It's social. I don't know all the acronyms. Sorry, it's the Social Something Party. It's the Social Democratic Party, but it's the letters are the other way around because it's in a different language. On the graph, it's the Red Party, which is handy for us because red's how we colour Labour in this country as well. They're essentially the Labour Party. But previously, from 2009 to 2013, the CDU was in coalition with the FDP, which is the party that's currently seeming to poll better. So maybe we'd get another one of those, but then the Green Party is still higher. So I think it'd be very interesting for a leading European country to have a big green contingent as part of their main coalition in government. So yeah, we'll see what happens. Keep our eyes on it. But it is later on in the year, in September.
This is me thinking aloud, but I know we talked on it last time when the Greens went above Union for the first time. Is it possible that the Greens have always been like more of a protest vote and people suddenly thought, oh my goodness, they could win? No, actually, I have to vote for somebody else. Like, it's very different when I always feel like a protest vote is very different to when you think, oh my goodness, somebody actually has to be in charge and the Greens are such an unknown quantity. Do we really want a Green leader? I would rather have Greens as an influence on my coalition, but maybe not as the figurehead. People might be thinking tactically like that, so it'd be interesting to see if they kind of dip up and down as it gets closer. But like you say, that is one to watch out for until September, just to see what happens.
Well, I think we should probably do a deeper dive in the run-up to September. I know that we have some German listeners, so maybe one of them would like to come on and give us some information, which would be great. But we will see how that goes. It could be that. It could also be, similar to how there's been like a vaccine bounce for the Conservatives over here. It could be a similar thing where people were frustrated at what was happening around vaccines. I don't know exactly what was going on in April in Germany in the same way, but you could see that being a thing. It could be any number of factors that we can investigate in the future. Watch out for an episode on Germany sometime before September. And so, as I say every week, thank you for joining me, Rob. If you want to follow us on all of the various socials, you can find us at Unparl Podcast on Twitter and on Instagram. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Reddit at /r/Unparliamentary. And of course, if you want to support this show and the other shows on the network, go to patreon.com/TTSS, where you can throw $1 our way to become a patron and get bonus episodes. Rob and I always record something before the episode. Other podcasts do different bonus episodes. Allows us to occasionally do like crossover episodes and things like that. So if you want to listen to any of that stuff, feel free. Also, you get like uncut, unedited versions. There was recently a long interview for Dr. Wilko's I did with someone who makes alcohol-free spirits in the US. So I uploaded an uncut version of that interview like 24 hours before the main episode went up. So if you want to get things earlier and hear slightly less polished version, but before everyone else, you can go over there and throw some money our way, which goes towards hosting and microphones and things like that. And we appreciate all of you. And there's a special chat on the Discord as well that you can join. And with that all said, I don't think there's anything else left for me to say other than it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him. Bye.
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 Say bye, Dora.
I just need to share this thing with you, which I almost like cracked up in the middle of our discussion about HS2. The HS2 website has like pictures of the stuff going on in Birmingham. There's a whole discussion about whether phase 2 will even happen because they need to like make it legal and get the money from somewhere. And they have this map, right, of HS2, Manchester interchange planned. It would be planned. It would take 59 minutes from Euston to Manchester Airport, which is amazing. Like you could, not have to fly from Heathrow all the time or whatever. Really cool. Lovely little map there. Someone's taken what is presumably the existing street map and added on that little drawing there. And then they're talking about how Manchester Piccadilly station might have to be embiggened as well. So again, lovely map. Someone's like overlaid. It doesn't have to be particularly smart, but you can see what they're planning to do. And then I scrolled down to the proposed new station in the East Midlands, and I was treated with something that I can only describe as a Microsoft Paint job. And I just lost it. I had to be very quiet. Just love it. It's just like 4 lines and a blue box. Sure. It's nothing like the others.
It's here, maybe. Yeah, I'll knock that up in 5 minutes, and then we can all go to the pub, lads. That's got that kind of vibe about it.
There are many great editors on Wikipedia, but that is very funny when you compare it to the other drawing. Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open.